Nigel, I think getting into your work on empire and colonialism, I think is evergreen, and it would be really interesting to get into the implications for that, and perhaps even uh, the the influence of empire that we're still feeling today here in Britain, and perhaps internally. But before we get there, I think unpacking some definitions, because when people talk about colonialism, the term is used very widely in lots of different situations, and you've suggested that it's used rather imprecisely. So maybe we begin with that. What is colonialism?
Great question to start with, John. Frankly, I prefer to avoid the word because the ism implies something coherent and unitary and cohesive, as if there was a thing. And so whenever we use the word colonialism, stick it on something, we know what it is. And usually nowadays, colonialism connotes something bad. It was racist, it was oppressive, it was economically exploitative. It involved, as a friend of mine remarked when I first got into trouble on this topic, it's all about oppression and subjugation. And in fact, if you look at the history of the British Empire, which lasted 400 years from 1550, 1960, thereabouts, and stretched from Newfoundland in eastern Canada to New Zealand, just above the Antarctic. It was many different things at different times and in different places, sometimes different things at the same time in different places. So I talk about imperial government or colonial government. You can talk about colonization. Not all empires were colonial. Not every part of the British Empire was colonial. To get back to the question you asked about what is it, empire. Let's start with empire. Empire is a political organization where one people dominates other peoples, and colonization is where one people lands on the territory of another people and sets up shop in large numbers. So certainly Europeans colonized North America to the point where white Europeans outnumbered native North Americans by the middle of the 19th century. Europeans also colonized Australia. Europeans did not colonize India. The Brits did not colonize India. They took over government. But even at the height of the British Raj in India in 1900, there were 300 million Indians. How many Brits? 164,000. These were not people who took over large tracts of territory on the whole. They were soldiers, certainly, administrators, financiers, traders. Yes, toward the end of the 19th century, you do get planters in northeast, the northeast of British India. So they buy land and they take over territory, but they're very small in number, and the amount of territory taken over is quite small. So empire doesn't necessarily involve colonization. Does that help?
It does. It does help. The question that I'm diving into a bit earlier than I anticipated, but there are, so some of those numbers you talked about there, 164,000 British at the height of the Raj, 300 million Indians. Depending on where you go looking on the internet, particularly with right-coded discourse, i.e. those leaning right-wing, you can find people suggesting that Britain itself is experiencing a kind of colonization due to the high numbers of immigrants that are coming in. What do you make of that notion. Do you think that there is the experience of mass immigration in Britain does stand up to scrutiny if we were to say that there is a type of colonization taking place, or does something else need to be happening for that to be true?
That's a really interesting question. And as you were posing it, I was going over in my mind and saying yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So on the one hand, my one reaction could be, well, most of the immigration is legal. That's to say, we let it happen. So if colonization takes place without the consent of the natives, in this case, we're the natives, then that's not colonization. But colonization of North America and New Zealand and even Australia did not always occur without consent. I mean, certainly sometimes British people took over territory, they seized it without the consent of the natives. Sometimes in North America, they walked onto territory that was vacant. Yes, it was vacant sometimes in the 1600s because European imported diseases had decimated the local population, who had then moved, leaving land vacant. Sometimes, and this was generally imperial policy. Normally, land would be occupied with the consent of the natives. Now, it didn't always happen, but often it did happen by treaty for one reason or another. So it's actually not true to suppose that colonization is necessarily coerced and unwelcome. So you could say, yes, you could say we're being colonized now, but largely without consent. But here would be the difference. Way back, in Roman times or even Greek times, you have Greeks and Romans sailing across the Mediterranean to Sicily or North Africa and setting up colonies. Now, these are cities with walls around them, with Greeks and Romans inside, and they dominate that territory. And the natives of North Africa or Sicily, they do their own thing. So the peoples are separate. Ideally here, when we admit immigrants who are going to be permanent residents, ideally they should integrate and assimilate because, Britain is not anywhere. We have certain traditions, we have laws, we have customs, we have a language. So in a sense, what ought to be happening is a measure of integration and assimilation. Now, I say a measure because, of course, there's no good reason why, let's say, people from Asia shouldn't carry on making curry or manning restaurants that we love to eat at. So in other words, you can retain your own culture, but I think when you move to another country permanently, you do need to pay sufficient respect to learn the language so you can participate and to obey the laws and the customs. And colonization would not involve that. It would involve a kind of creation of an enclave that you control with or without consent of the native peoples. But you wouldn't have colonists would not, as it were, assimilate into a larger population. But that's my initial thought on that.
Yeah, and I think that probably stacks up with those who've conducted work in this area. I don't know if you've read Paul Collier's book Exodus. I can't remember the subtitle. Yeah, it is very good. Yep. Where he said once you start reaching certain numbers of incomers, regardless of where it is, let's just run it as a hypothetical. You get to a point where a diaspora forms, and that diaspora has enough social and cultural capital that it doesn't actually need to interact with whoever it is that they're surrounded by and who were the original inhabitants, because they can set up their own economic systems to a certain degree. They can all help each other out, and they don't necessarily need to interact. And on top of that, culture is obviously driven by a whole bunch of things, whether it's religion, whether it's the place that you originally came from. And if people decide that that is much more worthy to hand down than wherever the place is they found themselves, then those diasporas become self-sustaining, and in some respects, I suppose, do get to the point you've just talked about, which is an enclave which is effectively under control of whoever that group might be, because of the nature of the diaspora.
That's a very, very good point. So yes, an enclave, or what you might call a ghetto, is a colony. And yes, I have read Paul Collier's book, and just to be absolutely clear, I mean, he's not against immigration, and nor am I.
No, he's not.
Nor you.
No.
He is in favor of the control of immigration, because precisely because if you get large numbers of people coming from one part of the world and landing in another at the same time, or in a short space of time, naturally, quite naturally, they congregate with their own kind, and they don't integrate, and that can cause problems for social cohesion. So in the early noughties, when I was living in Leeds, I remember having a conversation. There were some riots in Leeds, Bradford, not all involving young Asian men, also white men. But I remember asking the faith advisor to the Bishop of Bradford, what were the Anglican churches doing to try and build bridges between the white community and the Asian community in Bradford? And he said, well, we try. The problem is that they're not interested. Why? Because they have a self-contained community. They marry among their own, they trade with their own, they speak their own language, and they're self-contained. And I think that is a problem for larger social cohesion. And I think it's not inappropriate. I mean, strictly speaking, given all that we've said, it's not inappropriate to refer to that as a kind of colony, because it's not integrated. And that would be a feature of a colony, of a Greek colony in North Africa or Sicily. It's not integrated into a larger nation.
Yeah. Well, I was speaking with Harrison Pitt and Connor Tomlinson about this recently. I joined them on their show Deprogrammed, which I think you might have been on as well, actually.
Yeah, I think I have, yes.
And we spoke a little bit about the nature of liberalism, and I know Patrick Deneen has advanced this argument, which liberalism was so successful in the achievement of desire and the state being used to enable people to become very autonomous, that in the end you can lose a sense of cohesion, and you end up governing over a ragtag bunch of autonomous individuals who are fairly deracinated from the culture, but also those who do stick together, they are communities that don't really speak to each other. And I suppose that there might be a recognition of this by our own political class, because, as I mentioned in that interview, that leads to hearing our Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer refer to Britain's communities. We've shifted from the talk of a unity to communities, which suggests that there is a division, and perhaps does nod to what we've just been speaking about. Nigel, you wrote one of the lines in your book, Colonialism. I'm sure contentious with some people who see it as being a force for bad and being driven by certain motives, whether it's greed, whether it's white supremacy, or what have you. You wrote there was no essential motivation behind the British Empire. Try to describe that for the listener who has a certain view of what the empire was.
Yes. So let's go back to the beginning. And the beginnings are in the 1500s and early 1600s. In the 1500s, you get English seamen crossing the Atlantic and setting up, or trying to set up, bases on the eastern coast of North America. So what are they doing there? Do they have interest in taking over North America? Well, no. not at that point. They're there partly because they've heard tales of gold, so they're in search of gold. And I mean, that might sound rapacious and grubby to us, but hey, in the 1800s, in the 1800s, you have Chinese people going to Australia and Malaya in search of gold because people want to make themselves better off. Some of us play the lottery because we want to become filthy wealthy. It's no different, except we don't have to take the risk of crossing the Atlantic. Anyway, so some people were in search of gold, which they didn't find, but also they were commissioned by the Crown to make life difficult for the Spanish. The Spanish were shipping bullion from Spanish colonies in South America and the Caribbean to Spain, and Spain posed a mortal threat to England. So the irony there is that part of the origins of English empire in the 1500s was anti-imperial, right? They were against the Spanish Empire. Roughly a little later, in the 1600s, you have the East India Company set up. This is a company that had a royal monopoly to trade with India. So you have English merchants going out to India. Why? To trade. Why? To make money. No shame in that. But one thing leads to another in India and indeed in North America. And so you have the East India Company setting up trading posts with the permission of local rulers. And then the local rulers end up fighting wars with their neighbors. And they call upon their mates in the East India Company and say, hey, can you come and give us a hand? Because war is not good for trade, war is not good for the economy, the East India Company did have an interest in peace. It may not have an interest particularly in seeing one Indian prince beat another, but it didn't have an interest in peace. So helping one Indian prince overcome another, maybe the Indian prince had been attacked, was in the company's interests. They did that, and they got rewarded, sometimes with land, sometimes with porks. And over time, they gradually acquire more and more territory. And India, until 1858, was not ruled by the crown. It was ruled by a company. It was only after the horrors of the Indian Mutiny of 1857 that the British government took control away from the East India Company, and India became the possession of the crown. So there we have certainly people going out to try and make a better life for themselves, and of course in North America in particular, in the late 1700s and most of all in the 1800s, you have hundreds of thousands of British people, Irish people, Scottish people crossing the Atlantic in search of a better life, often fleeing poverty and famine in Scotland and England and Ireland. So the irony there is the immigrants who went across to North America to achieve a better life there, their motivation is no different from the people who are trying to cross the Channel right now. And we may, and I do think illegal immigration has to be stopped. Sympathetic though I might be to the people who are trying to build a better life, but the motivation may be okay, but the means in the case of illegal migrants is not. But again, in terms of what motivated the empire, and then yes, sometimes you get people who are professional military folk, and they like to do their stuff, and they go and invade territory they shouldn't invade, because what's a soldier for except fighting? But then you get the abolition of slavery in the early 1800s, and the British were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish slave trading and slavery, and from 1807 onwards, the British used their growing imperial power to suppress slavery from Brazil across Africa, across India, Malaya, Australia to New Zealand. So there was also a humanitarian motive. So when I say there's no single motive, the whole array of the motives, and not all of them were bad, and no economic exploitation and just conquering other peoples for the fun of it was not generally the case.
What are some of the goods that the British Empire produced?
Quite a number of them, and if let me encourage your listeners to go buy my book and look on page 277. You'll see a long list of good stuff, preceded on page 276 by a shorter list of bad stuff.
Which we can come on to, by the way. I don't want to tilt this too heavily in one favour.
No.
We'll just be accused of being shills for evils, I think, otherwise.
Absolutely, and whitewashing the empire.
Yeah.
So some of the good stuff. The imposition of imperial authority did end inter-tribal warfare in New Zealand, in South Africa, and elsewhere. Because when you have an overarching authority, it helps to stop squabbles between people who are subject to it. The authority can control and manage the conflict. So that was good, and it was good not only because it lessened the loss of life, caused people to be less generally fearful. It's also good, of course, for economic prosperity, because war is not good for economic prosperity on the whole. So there was that. Also from 1840 till 1920s, I think, the British Empire was committed to free trade. Yes, that meant that English manufacturers of cloth, English manufacturers who mass-produced cloth through industrial methods, could ship it out to India and undercut the prices of cloth produced by artisans in India, which was not good for the native producers. On the other hand, the imperial free trade allowed Indian entrepreneurs to send their sons to Cambridge and then observe industrial practices in Manchester, take back plant and expertise to India, build steel mills and textile mills in the 1890s, so that by the 1930s, India, I think, was the fourth largest producer of steel in the world, and the mills were owned by Indians. And by the way, you may have noticed, well, who owns what little remains of the British steel industry in South Wales?
Tata Steel.
Tata was an Indian industrialist who sent his son to Cambridge in the late 19th century, and he began to build his empire under the British. Yeah. So there was that. There was also the exploitation of liberal institutions and of a extraordinarily incorrupt civil service, most famously in India, but also in Africa. You may not like bureaucrats, but it sure helps if they're honest. And the British in India, and again in India, the senior civil service was populated by the British, and there were about 1,200 of them, but they were conscientious public administrators. And you get the tradition of the rule of law, impartial courts. You get a free press. You don't get democracy until 1930s in India, but then it was only in 1928 that men and women got the vote in equal terms in Britain. You don't get democracy, but you do get a free press, and the free press in Hong Kong, in India, in South Africa, often run not by Brits but by natives, could be fiercely critical of colonial government. And the judiciary in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s and 60s was fiercely critical of colonial government. And so the British exported liberal institutions that held colonial government to account in the way that government in China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia to this day is not held to account. And my final, two more points on the positive stuff. Final point would be that, the penultimate point would be 1939 to 45, the British Empire was committed to fight Nazi Germany. And between May 1940 and June 41, May 1940 when France fell, June 41 when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the British Empire offered Nazi Germany the only military resistance, with the sole exception of Greece. And then finally, just to toot the empire's trumpet, right now, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Britain, and the United States, all parts of the old British Empire at one point, are among the most prosperous and most liberal countries on earth. And according to the World Values Survey over a year or so ago, Britain, Australia, and Canada are among the least countries on earth. The least racist countries on earth, in sharp contrast to China, Russia, and Japan. So I rest my case, my lord.
Well, Billord, and I can actually call you that. I was wondering in my mind there how the nature of power as exercised in the British Empire came to be. And I suppose as someone who is an Anglican priest and knows a lot about the history of these British Isles, is in my mind, I was thinking, okay, we've got a very long history, which people say particularly started to bud when the Anglo-Saxons came here and set up this kind of free and easy government in some respects, and a relative liberty amongst peoples, and that started to spread amongst the Celtic fringe and what have you. And then in my mind, I think, okay, well, the Bible itself as a tract, I know the Russians have Orthodox, but perhaps a different historical set of links going on there with their ties to the Mongols and various things. I think Peter Frankopan has said Russian development and the corruption there could well be because of interactions with the Mongols in the past, and that's how the oligarchy came around. But anyway, back to those that the British Empire sprouted. Thinking about our developmental history, you then got the Bible, which is effectively the only book in which, or at least at that time, where those in the positions of power were being criticized, and it was being logged, and it was being celebrated, and that was a total inversion of, I suppose, the antique world. And so, do you think, I'm picking up on your point here about how people could be fiercely critical of colonial government, that didn't happen everywhere. Is that because of the things that I raised, or do you think there's something else behind it that made the British colonial governors stay their hands in the face of criticism from their subjects?
That's a really interesting question, John. So there's certainly a long biblical tradition of skepticism or criticism of royal monarchical power. And so the ancient Hebrew prophets would often be fiercely critical of the abuse of power, not just by rulers, but also by the rich. Did that influence those who administered the British Empire? Yes, I think it did. And it came to influence the notion that those who have power have it for public service, for the service of the whole public, and that would be connected with the gradual taming of monarchical power in the history, particularly of England. We all know my generation all lived in school. I'm not sure young generations learn this anymore. That the constitutional development here in England and Scotland and Britain, whereby yes, the king becomes increasingly accountable to and controlled by Parliament. In the medieval period, French observers were astonished at the extent to which the English king was limited by his council. Now, of course, the council gradually expanded. Initially, it was just lords, and it was lords and commoners. Commoners would be merchants, and then, as we know, in the 19th century, 20th century, the electorate expands. But even in medieval times, the sense that the king was not absolute. And on the two occasions in the history of England when kings tried to become absolute, most famously in the case of Charles I, he lost his head, and then James II tried to emulate that and lost his throne. Yes, I think there is a connection between, as it were, the Judeo-Christian biblical tradition and the notion of accountable, limited government. I mean, it is complicated because there were also people in the 1600s appealing to the Bible in favor of absolute monarchy. So Bible is a rather it's a book with many opinions because it's 60 different bits of literature created over about 1,000 years. So they don't also say the same thing. But there is certainly a strong stream there. And I mean, for example, just in terms of a kind of institutional connection, up until the reign of William III, on Maundy Thursday, where the practice was that the monarch would get on his knees and wash the feet of a number of his subjects in imitation of Jesus. Now, unfortunately, apparently William III didn't like doing that, so now the monarch hands out alms or charity, which is not, in my view, nearly as symbolically powerful. But and also in the coronation service. I mean, one reason I'm in favor of the monarchy as we now have it is that I do think it's very symbolically healthy that the head of state, when receiving the symbol of his or her authority in the form of the crown, does so on her knees or sitting. The crown is not seized like Napoleon. It's not put in his own head like Napoleon did. It is given from above. So the monarch is himself subject to a higher authority and is not absolute. So I think there is certainly a connection between biblical Christian tradition and that development of the limited executive and therefore space for criticism of it.
Fascinating. Let's not fall in the trap of whitewashing. There'll be some people keen ears going, okay, you've talked about the good, you've talked about why Britain was, for the most part, could be a fair and just governor. Let's talk about the injustice. What are some of the things that we really, truly should be ashamed of in our history as imperial governors?
So just a qualification. When I first began to think about these things about 8 years ago, yes, I talked in terms. I wrote an article in the London Times saying that we Brits can find cause in our imperial past for both pride and shame. But someone persuaded me actually that's not appropriate because you and I didn't do it, so we've no reason to feel guilty ourselves. So I talk now in terms of admiration and lament. So I lament things that if not my ancestors directly, then ancestors of my British people did. So what are the lamentable things? Well, to be lamented is the importation of disease. Probably the most devastating effect of colonization upon natives in North America and in Australia were diseases brought by Europeans and the British. Diseases to which we've become immune because we've been used to living with domesticated animals, and we become immune to the germs that they spread. But the natives of North America were not immune, nor were Aboriginal peoples. And so when Europeans first landed and first started interacting with the natives, the spread of disease was actually devastating. One American historian says that in the 1700s, if a Native American people suffered successive epidemics of disease over a 50-year period, they would lose 90% of their population. So that was terrible, and that's one reason why a lot of land was vacant. But here's the thing: no one intended to do that. There are only a couple of possible occasions when the British, once during the French and Indian Wars of the 1750s, 60s, possibly during the American Revolutionary War, when the British may have used disease as a biological weapon. But there are only one or two occasions. Most of the devastation was caused inadvertently, and what you do inadvertently, you can't be blamed for. So, by analogy, let's suppose the Communist Party of China did not deliberately spread COVID. Okay, we may want to blame them for not shutting their airports sooner, but the disease was spread, I think, inadvertently, but 7 million people died. And also, just to confirm that point, of course, it wasn't just Europeans who spread disease. It is, I think, widely accepted that smallpox first arrived on the northern coast of Australia, brought by fishermen from what's now Indonesia. Right, so spread of disease is unfortunately a universal phenomenon. It's not only white people who do it, and most of it was done inadvertently. So that was probably the most devastating thing. More culpable, lamentable things would have been, yes, the unjust seizure of land, and the expulsion of native peoples. It happened in North America, it happened in Africa, it happened in Australia. It didn't always happen. That wasn't always how land was acquired, but it did happen. And sometimes massively murderous killings of native peoples by British people in Australia or North America. So excessive violence. And yes, sometimes economic exploitation. I mean, a lot of people are very critical of the exploitation of Black Africans in South African mines in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Where conditions were very poor. I tend to be a bit resistant to that, simply because when is exploitation? I mean, African workers were not compelled to work for the mines. They chose to come. They were encouraged by, or coerced somewhat by the imposition of taxes. But they came, and they came again to work. And yes, the conditions were poor, but the conditions were poor for miners in Northumberland at the same time. And partly through the pressure from imperial authorities, the mine owners were forced to improve the conditions. But just as a matter of, I mean, I assume that there were certainly cases of unfair exploitation of native workers. They weren't paid enough, or they were worked too hard. But again, I mean, there was exploitation in England at the time, and no doubt there's been exploitation by native entrepreneurs in post-colonial times. But this reminds me, of course, of probably the greatest lamentable stain on the record of the British Empire, which was the 150 plus years of slave trading and slavery, starting about 1650, ending in the trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1834. That clearly was the greatest stain, and that's why our contemporary decolonizing critics want us to equate colonialism with slavery. The phrase colonialism and slavery is often spoken with in the same breath as if it was the same thing. And while the British involvement in slavery was certainly lamentable, I just point out that the second half of the British Empire's life was committed to anti-slavery, so you can't identify them. There was both. Fortunately, the anti-slavery followed the slavery and replaced it. The other thing to say about slavery is just to remember that for reasons that bear thinking about, slave trading and slavery was universal. Europeans did not go into the interior of Africa to seize slaves. Slaves were brought to them by Africans who had been enslaving other Africans and selling them to the Romans before they sold them to Arabs, before they sold them to Europeans. So the British, we can lament British involvement in slavery. We need to remember that most people were involved in enslavement and slavery. And I think we should be proud and admiring of the fact that toward the end of the 1700s, more and more Britons became convinced that slavery was abhorrent and should be stopped. And they stopped it. Thank goodness.
Here. Your book, when it came out, we talked about those decolonizing critics who would equate, as you say, colonialism with slavery and suggest that this is the biggest story within the imperial history of Britain. What was the response of former colonial subjects, perhaps, or at least people from those regions and countries that read your book? How have you found people have responded to the arguments that you've laid out of the good, the bad, and the ugly?
So, John, you'd expect that the responses would be various, as there have been among British people too. There are fiercely opposing views of these things, but one of the first things that I learned when I was dragged into the culture wars on this issue in December 2017 by several hundred academics who wanted to shut down, to silence me, was that people with non-white skins would write to me and say, "We agree with you." So, for example, I got an email in December 17 after the row about my views on empire got into the press, from a palliative medical consultant whom I'd met 10 years previously, who was British but of Indian ethnicity. And he wrote to me and said, "Nigel, you may not know, but my grandfather was in the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar in April 1919, when General Dyer infamously opened fire, ordered his Gurkha troops to open fire on what turned out to be an unarmed civilian crowd, killing several hundred. So my grandfather was there," he said, "but I agree with you. The British Empire contained good as well as bad." there are plenty of, and another example would be, this is just anecdotes, John, but they're indicative of the fact that it is not true that all of the subjects of empire, or the children of the subjects of empire, or the grandchildren of the subjects of empire think the same thing, which is the impression you might get if you listen to white champions of the colonial oppressed. I mean, why would you expect all Indians or all Nigerians to think the same thing? So a couple of years ago, there was a document produced by a Church of England body about the Church of England paying reparations for slavery, and it also recommended that the Church should apologize to Africans for the denigration and suppression of traditional African religion. And when I showed this to a young Nigerian woman, journalist come novelist, Christian, she was incandescent with dismay and indignation, because from her point of view, her people have been liberated from benighted traditional African religion into Christianity, and there are now 700 million African Christians. They weren't forced to become Christian. So one thing that surprised me, John, was pleasantly surprised that there are people with non-white skins who agree with me, and in fact, a project that I had launched in July 2017 on ethics and empire, I designed it with a very eminent historian of empire, and when I came under became the object of a campaign to shut me down, my white historian colleague abruptly resigned from the project. So I had to go looking for other historians to repopulate it, and in the course of 2018 I found them, and I found 4 new historians who came on board the project, 3 of whom did not have white skins. One was a British Iranian, another was a British Indian, and the other 2 were British Indians. One of whom, Zarir Mazani, who died sadly last year, his grandfather was a servant of the Raj. I mean, when I say servant, I mean he was a high-ranking servant, but he was actually committed to British rule in India, an Indian committed to British rule in India. His father, on the other hand, was an Indian nationalist. And Zarir started off on the left, and by the end of his life was on the right. And he was a doughty defender of the British rule in India, not uncritical, but a defender against those who think it was just nothing but a litany of racism and oppression. And Zarir was born right at the end of British rule in India, and he was the son of someone campaigning for Indian independence. So, of course, there are fierce critics of the British record in India and Africa and among Aboriginal people in Australia, but they are the only voices.
Well, this marries up with my experience. I worked with the British Nigerian chap about 7 years ago now, and I asked him, as someone who'd come over to London at the age of 12, how he felt. Does he feel like he's British now, having spent the last 30 years here? What does he think about the past relationship between Nigeria and Britain? He said, well, of course, I feel like you've got a bit of an identity crisis going on, but he recognises the good of Britain. And in fact, he says it was the first time I'd heard someone say this, because these are the conversations you typically don't have because you're told you shouldn't. But he said there was no doubt in my mind that it was a better governed society. And he started to tell me a lot about the corruption and the violence and the targeting of those who've lived in Western countries, and they come back and he says, I've got to wear different clothes. I've got to wear clothes that aren't the ones that I wear in Britain, because then they'll know I've got money. And also, even he was talking about bureaucracy as well. He said there's such low trust there that people, if an articulated lorry pulls up by the side of the road, everyone runs away in fright because they can't be sure it's been strapped down properly and it might crush them. So these were stories which I'd never even thought would get brought up. But he said, yeah, of course. I mean, I think on the whole, it would be, he said, I'm conflicted because it was better government, but would I be preferred Nigeria to be governed by its own people? Absolutely. And then he said, but I just don't think they're doing a particularly good job of it. And you don't really know what to say to that when you're in the workplace.
Yeah, and in the book, I quote Chinua Achebe, who is a famous African nationalist novelist, who on the one hand, you can find him saying, he wasn't at all happy about Brits coming in and governing his people. On the other hand, his father was a Christian missionary whom he admired, and he went to a Christian school, which he valued. And after independence, of course, Nigeria degenerated in the civil war over Biafra in the 1970s and suffered all sorts of institutional dysfunction. And just before he died in 2013, he was being interviewed by some Iranian journalists who were pressing him to condemn the British Empire or British colonialism, and he refused. He said, "No, it's complicated." He said, British justice was severe, but it was predictable. And he said, institutions worked. So he said it's complicated. So I think you can, and I do. I appeal to non-white witnesses. I appeal to the native governed, or the children of the native governed, to defend the empire.
Well, that's the only way to do it, I think. If you're going to back up those points. Yeah. Before I wrap up the main body of the show and move to two subscriber-only questions, which can be relatively quick fire, I don't want to keep you all night, yep. Nigel. You've already been very good with your time. Last question that I ask all of my guests in the main body of the show is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life that you thought was previously unshakable, perhaps? And what was it that led you to change your mind?
You didn't warn me about this. In course of my life. Well, off the top of my head, John, I'm 69. I was born in 1955. I grew up in the 60s. I think I kind of absorbed a sense of national diffidence and self-uncertainty, where it was for a long time, if you spoke up in favor of Britain, you were regarded as kind of naive or stupid or unsophisticated. One of the advantages of older age is it's a dangerous combination of two things. First of all, you finally figure out what you think. And secondly, you care less what other people think. So you say what you think. And I have recent years been describing myself as a British patriot. No, I'm not a fascist. I'm not a Nazi. I don't think Britain is perfect. But if you love something, it's only if you love something that it can disappoint you. And Britain disappoints me a lot. But I think this is a great country, and I want it to be its better self. and I'm fed up with having to hide that, and I'm not hiding it anymore. So that's one thing that's changed. It's not that my views have changed. I think the views have always been there, but I speak them with greater confidence. And if people want to dismiss me as a Nazi because I'm saying that, then that's on them. It's just stupid. Yeah. So that's one thing.
Nigel, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me and for being so generous with your time. I look forward to seeing you produce the books and your other projects you're working on, and I'd love to be able to invite you back on to talk about those in future.
Thanks, John. It's been great talking to you, and I'm glad that we've talked about some really important things that I hope your listeners will have learned from. And yes, I'll be glad to come back in the future.
Wonderful news. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.